Hi, KRB parents. Welcome to week 6 in the Maximize Mental Health Care webinar series. Today, we will be focusing on self-awareness and how you can help yourself to understand your parenting style. So, as an overview, here are the 8-week webinar series topics. And of course, today we are on week 6, self-awareness. So, starting with an introduction, what are we hopefully learning about today? What is self-awareness and what are the benefits for you of having self-awareness? How do you gain internal self-awareness? And how do you understand your own strengths, interests, and values? How do you learn your parenting style? And how do you gain external self-awareness? And finally, what are the barriers to self-awareness? So an outline of what today looks like, as we've just covered and we'll be going through. A reminder that in week 4, we looked at how to understand your children and their strengths, interests, and values. And today we're looking at how to really understand yourself and your own strengths, interests, and values in addition to your own parenting styles. So week 4 was really interpersonal awareness, and then today we're looking at intrapersonal awareness. So the difference between these two is that interpersonal was how you understand your children. Today, we're looking at how you understand yourself. So starting with what is self-awareness and how is it defined? Going back to Aristotle, he defined self-awareness that knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. Daniel Goleman, a prominent psychologist who studies emotional intelligence, he said that self-awareness is the first component of emotional intelligence, or EQ. Self-awareness means having a deep understanding of one's emotions, strengths, weaknesses, needs, and drives. And people with a strong self-awareness are neither overly critical nor unrealistically hopeful. Rather, they're honest with themselves and with others. So a few things to point out here. Firstly, as you can see by Daniel Goleman's book, and you may have already heard of this in your own experience, how the importance of EQ, or emotional intelligence, can matter, in fact, more than IQ. And we'll look at that and how that plays out for you and your children. And also, the relevant thing here that we'll talk about in depth further on is about how emotional intelligence and self-awareness particularly is not about having an overly critical or unrealistically hopeful view of yourself, but it's rational. And that's, as we've looked at before, is about mental well-being and health. So there's different ways it's been defined so far. More recently, self-awareness is the ability to see yourself clearly and objectively through reflection and introspection. So as again it states, it's an objective, it's not a made up or fictitious version of yourself, and how reflection and looking at yourself not only in the mirror, but really examining through introspection, you can develop your own self-awareness. Finally, the important thing is that it's a conscious knowledge of one's own characters and feeling. And what does that mean? How do we develop a conscious knowledge in particular? So there's 3 categories of self-awareness, according to one theory. This is looking at what am I thinking, feeling, and doing. So this is all part of the self-awareness and introspection process, which is looking at what your thoughts are, your feelings, and your behaviors. So as you'll remember, this links to cognitive behavior therapy that we use as psychologists every day. And so in doing so, self-reflecting and developing self-awareness is almost like a mini CBT strategy or concept that you are able to look at yourself and particularly attend to those thoughts, feelings, and actions and behaviors. Another way to look at self-awareness is in terms of it being internal or external. So internal is really understanding what we think of ourselves. External, on the other hand, is knowing what other people think of us. To look at that more closely, internal is how we clearly see our own values, passions, aspirations, our fit with our own environment, reactions, including thoughts, feelings, behaviours, strengths and weaknesses, and our impact on others. So internal self-awareness is really how we look at ourselves. On the other hand, external self-awareness is how we can clearly see other people's view of us, and in terms of those same factors we just looked at. So it's looking more meta in terms of, well, we see ourselves in one way. Do other people see us in that way, or do they see us in another way? And then you can compare and contrast to your own sense of internal self-awareness. Some of you may be familiar with the Johari window. Here is an application how it relates to self-awareness. As you can see, there's two axes in terms of external and internal self-awareness. So on the vertical purple line, you can have a varying degree of external self-awareness that goes from low to high. And of course, you can also have a varying degree of internal self-awareness, which goes from left to right. As you can see here, the two concepts of self-awareness or types are not related, and you can have one without the other. So for instance, you can have a high internal self-awareness, which means you have a really good concept of yourself, but you have low external self-awareness. That would be the bottom right quadrant. So for instance, you understand how you see yourself, but you're not as sure about how other people see you. Also, you can have a high external self-awareness. So for instance, you can understand how other people see you, but you yourself don't necessarily have a really strong concept of who you are. So that would be the top left. Of course, the ideal is having the best of both worlds. So having that high internal self-awareness, that top right, and also a high external self-awareness. And that's where we call aware. So you have that awareness ultimately. So that means you understand who you are and you've got a really good self-concept, but you also understand how other people see you. These people also are able to realize, what they want to accomplish, and also other people can see what they have in their goals and their directions as well. In terms of the top left, we just looked at these two before, so they don't necessarily know who they are, but they're very fixated on or know very well what other people think of them. And they're more the people pleasers that you may have heard of. So they appear a certain way and they may overlook actually what matters to them in the process. In the bottom right, we have introspectors. So these are people that tend to have quite high self-awareness. So they know what they think of themselves and they're very introspective, but they don't necessarily know their impact or how other people are thinking about them. So therefore that low external self-awareness. And finally, we have seekers who have neither internal or external self-awareness. So they're not necessarily very sure of who they are, what they stand for, and then they also aren't really aware of how they have an impact on people around them. So you may know of these sorts of people in your own lives, maybe in a personal setting or in a work or professional context. So probably good to think about how that relates already to people you may already identify, and also for yourself to really start thinking about and have self-awareness on where you sit on the self-awareness axis as to where you would be yourself. Another theory, of course, relates to Freud's interpretation of the iceberg theory. So there's a few layers of what's in our awareness and what's not. So of course, in our awareness is the conscious stage where we know who we are, and also we're sure of what other people know of us. And beneath that is the things like the subconscious and also the unconscious and the different biases or things that we may pick up that we give off, for example, by virtue of our non-verbal actions and cues, which can have more of an impact down at those lower levels. As we heard before, one of the definitions of self-awareness was about the conscious knowledge. So we're really trying to lift and elevate what is in our unconscious and subconscious, both knowing about ourselves, but also what other people know about us, into the conscious. So it's important that it's made aware of, hence the aware in self-awareness. So moving on to the benefits of self-awareness and how does self-awareness benefit you, particularly as parents? So there's different types of benefits depending on the different types of self-awareness you have. So for instance, for the internal, again, reminding that that's the awareness and knowledge of ourselves and our own self-concept. That has various benefits such as, in your own professional context, greater job satisfaction. You'll have greater relationship satisfaction, not only in a professional, but also ideally a personal context with your children, for instance. You'll most likely have greater personal and social control. Those with internal self-awareness have also found to be ultimately happier and have less mental health issues because they have that assured sense of their own self. On the flip side, those with external self-awareness have benefits such as being more skilled at showing empathy, which makes sense, of course, because if you're able to understand what other people think of you, you're able to understand and interpret their different perspectives, which means therefore you're better at taking on other people's perspectives, understanding from their worldview. You're also more likely, if you have a higher degree of external self-awareness, to have better relationships, and that would include, for instance, with your children, and also greater relationship satisfaction, both with your children and in personal context, but also potentially professional context. Other benefits, as you can see here, for having self-awareness overall, you're more likely to be more confident. You're more likely to be creative. Self-awareness has also been linked to better decision-making. We've looked at stronger relationships. You're also more likely to communicate more effectively, less likely to lie, cheat, or steal, probably because you don't have so much to hide. Better leaders, which may help in a work context, but also as a leader to your own children. You would have more likely a more realistic sense of yourself and greater mental health and well-being, as we saw, particularly for having that internal self-awareness, and better role models ultimately for children, because knowing who you are and having that certain sense of self is very reassuring and a great role model, therefore, for younger people, particularly children. So particularly looking at that realistic element, as we saw before, Daniel Goleman defined self-awareness as, or people with having self-awareness, as being neither overly critical nor unrealistically hopeful. And I touched on the benefit here, therefore, ultimately it's saying that you get to be more realistic and you're more rational, which of course, as we know, is one of the key proponents of having mental health and well-being. So when you're actually in touch objectively with who you are and understanding what other people think of you and what they interpret and define as you, you're also more likely to understand what's actually happening and what's more realistic, which of course, therefore you're out of that delusional space, which is unrealistically hopeful or overly critical, which is not necessarily in touch with what actually is happening. So it's good for you, particularly in terms of promoting your own mental health and well-being as parents. So how do you as parents actually cultivate this internal self-awareness? So a reminder that internal self-awareness is about how clearly we see our own values, passions, aspirations, etc. There are many ways to cultivate internal self-awareness, but a few that I would like to call out and then we will explore deeper are, firstly, about creating time and space. And while this seems obvious, but actually this is something to develop and grow from, you need to still dedicate the time to doing so by carving out solitude, thinking about what actually you are good at, for instance, what are your parenting styles that are helpful. Without that thought process, you can't therefore lead to management and therefore intervention. Secondly, practicing mindfulness, and mindfulness being sometimes a bit of an unknown, but really all this means is attending to your own thoughts, behaviors, and feelings and actions that we've already looked at. that we will look into more detail. Exploring strengths, interests, and values. So we've looked at this in the past for how you can help explore these in your children, but for you, looking specifically at your own and what are you good at? What are some of the areas you want to work on? What are you actually interested in? What do you value? Furthermore, identifying your parenting style, and you're probably already aware at a high level what sort of style and order you create or don't create around the house, for instance, and how you tend to want to develop and grow your own children. But looking at four particularly, we will look at today and how they impact your children and mental well-being. Also recording your awareness, so actually writing down and putting these sorts of learnings on paper helps to make things more objective. It's another reason why journaling is such a great CBT or cognitive behavior therapy technique, because when you put it on paper, it takes away all of the irrational thoughts and ruminative going round and circles in your head, for instance, puts it on paper, therefore you can action it. And finally, seeking personal development. So developing certain areas that you still want to improve, for instance, and also continuing to amplify those strengths. So as mentioned, practicing mindfulness is attending to what are you actually thinking, feeling, and doing. And as mentioned, this is a form of cognitive behavior therapy. I do believe if you do anything else, if you don't do anything else, mindfulness is really key across all domains, not just in terms of developing your own self-awareness, but it's an excellent tool for improving your own mental health care and well-being. How you do that is actually becoming in tune with your specific thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So for instance, it might be every time that your child turns on the TV when you're watching dinner and you've told them not to, it's you then reacting and behaving in a way that might yell at them, might start thinking, oh my gosh, I wish you just stopped doing that. So recognizing, being like, oh, interesting, talking to yourself, whatever your name is, interesting, Johnny, I wonder why you react every time to that. It's just recognizing in the first instance, if you don't manage or if you don't measure anything, you can't manage it. So the first instance is always recognizing, measuring it, and being more aware of it and in tune with it. So that's really what practicing mindfulness means. It's becoming super aware of your own thoughts, feelings, reactions. So one element of that we're going to explore in more depth is around how you can explore your own strengths, interests, and values. And we looked at this last week or 2 weeks ago, how you could do this with your children, but specifically how you can do this in terms of looking at your strengths, interests, and values. So starting with strengths, obviously KRB has a huge positive psychology and strengths-based approach to how they teach children, not only in their day-to-day academics, but also to become global citizens and think about their impact beyond just school. In the same virtue, I would suggest you also look into your own VAA character strengths. So there is a free report online to do, which looks at 24 different strengths and virtues that categorize them according to different domains. So as you can see here, wisdom, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, and transcendence. This is an excellent tool just to develop your first internal self-awareness and what are your strengths. And this is not just for your own personal application at home and as a parent, but also definitely suggest doing this in a professional context too. Here you can see an example report that you get from doing that. This is a paid one, but as I mentioned, you can also get a free one. There is also the option to look at your children's use report that we did last week, and you can have Decoder or a Decoder report, which gives you the applications for your yourselves as parents as well. What I particularly like about this one is, as you can see on the bottom right, how others would describe you. So that's helping to not only develop your own internal self-awareness, but also your external self-awareness, which we know is very important in developing a holistic awareness of yourself. Also, we looked at last or 2x Curve, Clifton Strengths, and the Gallup. Another excellent tool which you could also do for yourself to find out your own strengths as a whole, and think about how they would apply to your teaching, parenting, and how you could learn different things from this. As you can see here, again, there's some things that would draw your attention to. What makes you stand out, for instance? So elevating strengths is always far more powerful than necessarily just improving development areas. So something to help you to amplify there. Also, there's questions so you can help self-reflect on different insights. Again, journaling, writing down what you can take away here is going to help amplify those far more than just continuously thinking about them, actually putting pen to paper. This is an excellent book that we got as early training psychologists, and there is a promo code or something to go online here so that you can do the report for free. I think this is an excellent overview of all the different types of strengths, and you can think about this more broadly beyond just yourself, but also then your children, for instance, and gain an insight into what are strengths. So having a look at that would be a suggestion. In terms of what I do as a psychologist, these are the sorts of reports that we administer for children, but also parents in helping develop their own self-awareness, and also identifying their own strengths. So for instance, this is the Saville Wave competency profile, which I think is excellent. It gives different domains in terms of what would be your certain strengths and your potential, but also performance enhancers on the top right, which again, I mentioned enhancing strengths and developing what you're already good at is far more advantageous, in my opinion, than focusing on just the negatives and trying to solve for those weaknesses in inverted commas. So another excellent tool, also particularly more psychometrically valid and reliable. So I prefer these ones because there's a bit more rigor to them as well. In the same instance, this is more from an extra development perspective, assessing your own cognitive abilities and strengths from a more cognitive perspective. So this looks at things such as verbal, numerical, error checking, spatial, mechanical, and diagrammatic, which can also help in opening your own eyes and developing your own internal self-awareness. Moving on to interests, I'm sure you already know what your own interests and hobbies are, but as a tool, there is, as we looked at before, Holland's interest types. These may cover things like realistic, so working with your hands, versus investigative, versus artistic, social, enterprising, conventional. Another psychometric assessment that we use is the self-directed search for children, particularly looking at career guidance or deciding on different subject selections. But also I use this with adults in navigating, what are they good at? What do they want to work on? Are they in the right career, for instance? How can they amplify the strengths they need to from a job perspective? So from your perspective, still a good tool to help solidify those interests, and self-awareness is always a good thing, as we've looked at. And finally, values, and how do you as parents have your own values? How do you identify them? What are the principles and beliefs that you're bound by that also have an impact, obviously, on your children, and how you role model those? So, of course, Kinkoppel have the Sacred Heart Goals, which is a huge part of the value system at the school, and also having a huge impact, of course, on your children. So things like an active and personal faith in God, a deep respect for intellectual values, building of community as a Christian value, a social awareness which impels to action, and the personal growth in an atmosphere of wise freedom. Of course, you yourself have your own values as well, which as a family may have been developed and over time and act independently or in alignment with the values of the school. Those values are also at home impacted by and layered with the societal values on top of the school values, which lead to ultimately the child and your children yourselves. So importantly is to note, what are your values that are very intrinsic and part of your child's development, and how do they impact their own thoughts, feelings, and behaviours and actions on a day-to-day basis. So good for you to self-reflect on those and gain insight. Here is a list, for instance, of values that we use from a ACT perspective, so that acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a type of psychology therapy that we use at Maximize and most psychologists use. So this is a tool you could use, for instance, to help understand what is most important to you ultimately, and thinking about and reflecting on how those have an impact on your children. Just a caveat to this section on the strengths, interests, and values. None of these products I'm personally affiliated by. I just think they're all excellent tools that I've researched and done in my own experience and used over time. So just so that you know, there's no self-interest here. They are all just what I think are excellent tools to use. Moving on to parenting styles. And this is another element of helping you to develop your own internal sense of self-awareness. There are 4 different types of parenting styles that I would like to share with you today that we talk to parents often as clients about, and the impact that these have on a child and their own personal development, particularly in relation to their mental health and well-being. So as you can see here, there's 2 axes. One is about control and one is about the level of warmth. So in terms of the control, there may be a high level of control or a low level of control. When you have a high level of control and a high level of warmth, for instance, you will more likely have an authoritative parenting style. We will look more into what this specifically looks like. Just so that you're aware at this stage, there's different axes and different levels of control and warmth that can impact your child. So for instance, on that authoritative, what does that actually look like? This might be a firm but fair enforced rules at home. There would be two-way conversations, so it's quite collaborative, and ultimately you have a positive relationship with your child. In this case, in the instance when there's things that don't go quite right or a child has a concern, your response may be something like, well, actions have consequences, and I'll take your perspective into account and give them that reassurance and validation. As you can see here, this is ultimately the best case scenario because you do have a control in a warm environment. This is really important for children to have guidance ultimately and to know what to expect and when to expect it, but also have that support and safety net of the warmth and know that their values and their perspective is always going to be taken into account. So ultimately, overall impacts of children of an authoritative parenting style. Children will have a higher sense of self-esteem and confidence. They will have better emotional quotient, and they'll have excellent social skills. So this is ultimately the gold standard of what we're trying to achieve in terms of parenting styles, and we'll look at how, particularly next week, in terms of prevention of mental health and well-being, mental illness, this is things that you can do particularly to promote that. Another type of parenting style is, of course, authoritarian, so high control and low warmth. So in this case, there's a focus on obedience and punishment over discipline. This can result in quieter children because there's less warmth, it's a bit more dogmatic, quite rigid. Enforcement rules are seen as the gold standard here. So in this instance, a parent may say things like, I'm the parent because I said so, kids need to toughen up, that sort of perspective. The impact of children on children, of course, is that they're more likely to feel stressed and anxious, have lower self-esteem and poorer social relationships. Another parenting style is permissive. So this is when you have high warmth and low control. So a permissive style would not necessarily enforce rules. However, they are very empathetic and caring. So they definitely have that warmth, but there's just more of a lax environment. So the control sits with the child rather than the parent. And the things that may be indicative of a permissive parenting style or thoughts might be things like kids will be kids, or they'll grow out of it, and I'm sure they'll develop their skills later. So it's definitely warmth and caring environment, very supportive, perhaps arguably sometimes too supportive, without enough discipline and rules and regulations around what's expected of a child. Impact of children for permissive parenting style is that there's some self-control issues, particularly because they are not exposed to discipline and rules and regulation, and they find it hard to then control themselves when they have to. Can impact poor social relationships because they're not taught boundaries necessarily at home. That can trickle through to personal relationships, which can then meet them with difficulty. And also poor academic performance because there's not as much rigor around what is expected and when is expected at home. They can suffer academically. And finally, a more parenting style that's involved in uninvolved, reflective of uninvolved. So this might be, this is of course low warmth and low control. So not as much rapport, kindness, caring at home, just probably less attention, not necessarily being present, less guidance, and low control. So don't really care what they're doing. You've got your own things going on, and therefore the child does what they wish. So things that you may hear here are, I don't have time to deal with them, and teachers can teach them this sort of stuff anyway. So a real hands-off approach, which can obviously have impacts on children, such as higher stress and anxiety, so less certainty for them. They're not sure what to do, when to do it as well, and don't necessarily have that safety net of the warmth and the supportive environment at home. Can impact them and have low self-esteem, and of course, because of the lack of structure and routine, poor academic performance. Two clear consequences that I want to call out to you. If there is an authoritarian or an uninvolved parenting style, so more on the low warmth, overall low warmth at home, this is where you have in children self-esteem issues typically. So there's not as much of that support at home. There's not necessarily as much of that guidance, attention necessarily, or positive attention. It's quite dogmatic or routine, as in the case of the authoritarian, or inattentive and absent in case of uninvolved. So that can result in self-esteem issues. Alternatively, when there's less or lack of control at home. So in the permissive, it might be that the control's all with the children or the child, and uninvolved, again, with the child, and added to that is lack of warmth and supportive environment. That's where children can not necessarily thrive in an academic sense because they don't have those boundaries, rules, regulations, and frameworks to help them succeed and thrive. This is particularly something we're going to look at next week in terms of preventing not only mental illness, but also helping to focus more on what are the ways that we can set boundaries to help them thrive, both personally and academically. So in sum, ultimately, developing internal self-awareness here would be reflecting on which of these parenting styles or multiple parenting styles that you have and adopt. You will probably adopt all of them at some stage, potentially. You may have a combination of a couple, so it's not necessarily that you are in one bucket and that's it, and that's how you always are. And even if that is the case, then I think there's development opportunities to then strive towards the authoritative, particularly how we'll look at that next week. but more just for you to help self-reflect on where are you overall in terms of the control and warmth, and what that looks like for you as a parent, and how your parenting styles, but also how that impacts your children. And finally, how do you as parents cultivate external self-awareness? A reminder that external self-awareness is about understanding how other people view us in terms of your values, passions, aspirations, how you fit with the environment, reactions, etc. So it's really on how do you understand other people to understand you. So how do we cultivate external self-awareness? Again, there's quite a few different ways, but some of them are creating that time and space. So really carving out the time to actually dedicate to learning more about what other people think of you. How do you do that? Seek different perspectives. So speaking to people, and we'll look at specifically how to do that. Practice active listening. We've looked at this previously in terms of how to do that with your children, but also how do you do that to develop your own sense of self-awareness. Asking what rather than why in response when people do give you feedback, and we'll look at what that looks like, particularly, and what that actually means. Also comparing your external self-awareness learnings with what you found out or what you already know about yourself in terms of an internal self-awareness. And finally, seeking personal development so that you can upskill and continue to develop and self-improve on any of those areas that you think are needing to be developed. So in terms of seeking different perspectives, there's many different ways to do this. One way is, of course, doing a 360 feedback. So looking for a number of different perspectives to hear about what you have as strengths, development areas, and also things to consider as a parent, but also as an individual yourself. So, for instance, speaking to more senior parents, this may be firstly your own parents, but of course, speaking to other parents who have already gone through raising children at the same age can be very valuable and helpful, and getting their feedback and perspective on how you're already doing in relation to that same sort of age and stage for your children, but also any other advice and guidance they may have. On the left-hand side, hearing from teachers what they say about not only your children, but also how you can interpret what they say to take on feedback at home as a parent, and how you can help foster different practices and routines that may benefit your children. Also speaking to fellow parents, so this may be children of parents of children who are friends at school. Other parents could also be your partner or spouse if you have one, and understanding from their perspective what you're doing well, what areas could improve upon. And lastly, but not leastly, actually asking children and your own child or children what they think you're doing well, and what they can help, that you can help support them with, things that they may need particular guidance on, for instance, and really listening and being in tune to them to help develop your own self-awareness and insights. We also looked at active listening in relation to children, but also when speaking to those sorts of people, how can you foster active listening? So firstly, and most importantly, and these are 3 principles as a psychologist that we're taught, of course, empathy, non-judgment, and rapport. So trying to apply the same principles when listening for feedback for yourself. So empathy is really trying to understand, well, what's their perspective from their shoes, rather than your own perspective. Really listening for what's the meaning behind what they're saying, rather than just the actual words they're using to try and give you some insight or perspective. Non-judgment, obviously taking away any sense of prejudice, only hearing from their perspective, regardless of whether you agree with it, don't disagree with it, want to take it on or not. At this stage, it's still just hearing from a place of judgment-free, no bias. And of course, rapport, that natural warmth and I think, support that helps, as we've just seen, from a parenting style that can help not only foster a good regard between you and someone, which will help you to develop a strong relationship and therefore be more likely to receive feedback going forward. Also, attending to those non-verbal cues. We looked at this, the importance of facial gestures, body movements, and the way that people say things is far more important, or how they say it, it's far more important than what they actually say. And finally, respecting silence, as the Japanese were very good at, that we looked at last week, and tolerating those silences and pauses, which can be very advantageous, not only on a personal perspective, but also in professional perspectives as well. So once you have actually listened to the feedback that people are kindly giving you, another key skill of developing self-awareness, particularly external self-awareness, is then responding with a what versus a why response. So for instance, imagine you're at parent-teacher interviews with your teacher and someone says your teacher needs more structure and routine at home. Typically, our response is to say something like this, or why does she think that? And why would this be the case? Why do I have to do this at home? Maybe you can implement some structure and routine at school. A good tool to develop your own external self-awareness is then to think, what awareness is there to support this? What can I do on my end to try and help respond to what she's saying? So the what question is very powerful rather than a why in helping to promote that self-awareness. It also helps to stay objective, remain future focused, and empowers you to action and act on these new insights, as opposed to being more defensive and responding to a comment as an attack rather than a piece of feedback, which of course feedback is always a gift to develop and improve on. So ultimately, barriers to developing self-awareness are ones that we've already explored. So to summarize, self-awareness is inhibited by not creating time and space. Seems like an obvious one, but you do have to carve out the time to dedicate in order to improve your own knowledge, not only of yourself, but also what other people think of you. Practicing mindfulness. So if you're not doing that and you're not attending to actually what you're thinking, feeling, doing, and behaving, you're not going to gain any more insight. It's inhibited by not exploring your own strengths, interests, and values. So by not actually doing the psychometric assessments, for instance, or looking at what are your inherent passions and gifts, what you're good at, not only in a personal context at home as a parent in relation to your child, but also beyond that, outside, a professional context or more of your own social context, that can inhibit your own self-awareness. It's also inhibited by not identifying your parenting style. And as we've looked at today, having insight into knowing how much control and warmth you exert and impose at home is really insightful in terms of helping to identify what you're good at as a parent and what implications that has on your child. Self-awareness is also inhibited by not seeking the different perspectives. So it's important to go and speak to other people, whether that be fellow parents, former or more seasoned parents, for instance. Also speaking to your children and getting their feedback really is insightful to help you to acknowledge the role that you can have and play, and also to help you improve in those areas where you may need to. Self-awareness is inhibited also by not practicing that active listening, so tuning in to the non-verbal cues particularly, also respecting silence, things like that. Recording your awareness, I've said this, but also journaling. I think that's always a good idea for everyone, anyone, regardless of whether you have mental illness or not. Puts it on paper, makes it more objective. It helps to take away the subjectivity and makes things more objective to help reflect, and you can't, of course, manage what you do not measure in the first place. And finally, seeking personal development. That's pivotal in developing self-awareness, particularly in developing those things that you are wanting to build upon and how they relate to your child. Self-awareness is also inhibited by another 4 things that I want to share with you today. There's many other things, I'm sure, but particularly looked at asking why, not what. So asking why is more of a defensive reaction, which assumes that you need to have a reason for why, what the rationale is or the reason behind what they're saying. What helps you to take it on already in that moment, to start reflecting on what is actually within your control? How can you remain action focused and actually listen and respond to what they're saying? Also inhibited by having a fixed mindset. Something I'm sure we don't need to worry about at Kin Couple, because we promote and love a growth mindset, which is very important, and knowing that we have the opportunity always to self-improve and develop. For background, if anyone's not aware, a fixed mindset is the philosophy that we are born the way we are, and this is how we are, so there's no point trying to change or improve that. It's just, it is what it is, sort of thing. So that perspective, which is very focused and heavily influenced by the nature debate, which means that we've been influenced by genetics and this is how we're born, obviously impedes the development and growth that can come from knowing that there's a huge part of the nature that can impact what is the potential and how it can grow and develop still, which of course I think is very powerful and important. Self-awareness is also inhibited by power and experience. This is something that has been found in more leadership studies, HBR, Harvard Business Review, and places like that, which focus on the fact that if you're in a more senior position, by virtue of getting there in the first place, you have already developed all the skills you probably need, and therefore it means that we're less likely to take on the feedback and continue to improve. That philosophy is starting to change in the sense that if we focus on, as we saw what Goldman said, developing more of that emotional intelligence and self-awareness has been pivotal to how important EQ is, and developing and continuing to grow. The theory is that is far more important going forward, EQ, rather than necessarily just IQ. So I think from that lens, really thinking about how, if you've got any predispositions to having the power experience, particularly in professional context, but also as a parent, you've already survived 3 other children, so I know what it is, this will work. Unfortunately, the world's changing and the rates of mental illness, as we've seen, are increasing. So really trying to park any biases and things at the door is going to help to develop your own self-awareness and take on that feedback, which leads to the final one, which is, of course, cognitive biases. So this always worked. I don't need to change anything. Whatever's already helped me is going to continue to help me. Those sorts of things will inhibit your own personal self-awareness, which is not advantageous, not only for yourself, but also I think in keeping up and growing with the increasing rates of change that are happening to our girls, and particularly your children. So finally, a summary of what we've hopefully learnt today. Self-awareness is a wisdom and type of emotional intelligence that involves understanding one's emotions, strengths, weaknesses, needs, and drives. It's the ability to see yourself clearly. The benefits of self-awareness include greater job satisfaction and relationship satisfaction. It's linked to greater happiness, empathy, perspective taking, and it allows you to be more realistic and ultimately have a greater mental health and well-being. As one type of self-awareness, internal self-awareness, which is clearly seeing ourselves, can be cultivated by exploring your own strengths, interests, and values, and identifying your own personal parenting styles. Your strengths, interests, and values can be understood by taking psychometric tests such as the VIA character strengths, Clifton strengths, Saville, self-directed search, just to name a few that we've looked at today, but also to learn more about yourself. You can learn your parenting style by attending to your level of control and warmth, particularly towards your children or child, to understand if you have or are more of an authoritarian, permissive, or uninvolved parent, or a combination of those, and noting that you can be different things at different times. External self-awareness, which is knowing how others see us, can be cultivated by seeking different perspectives, practicing active listening, and asking what rather than why. That helps to remove that defensiveness and allows the feedback flow to come. Finally, barriers to self-awareness include not creating time and space for it, not practicing mindfulness and being in tune to your own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, not seeking different perspectives, not necessarily practicing active listening, and instead by having a fixed mindset, having parent experience, and potentially cognitive biases. And finally, if you wouldn't mind, please scan the QR code to answer one question to see how your knowledge has developed throughout today's webinar. That would be much appreciated, all in the interest of developing my own self-awareness. And any questions you can add there too. And finally, resources. As always, emergency contact details are here. In the event that you do need to contact someone, please do so. Maximinds also has 24/7 resources for you. If you would like to access these, please use the QR code here, where you will find access to strategies, activities, tools to help you and your children manage various mental illnesses. I'm also available to be contacted anytime using the contact details here. Look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.